Okay, so this is lecture 7 of part 2 of Moses Maimonides, his life and thought. And we're in the 14th book of the Mishnah Torah, and we're going to be looking to this week and next at the Hilchot Milachim, the laws of kings and their wars. Today we're going to focus on the king and warfare, and next week we're going to deal with the final section, which is about the Messianic era. So let's begin by first of all talking about what are the biblical sources on which Maimonides and the rabbinic tradition are building on when they're talking about kingship and warfare. And the thing that you have to understand is that this is entirely theoretical, even from rabbinic times. First of all, there isn't a lot of material about the laws of war or the laws of kingship in the legal codes in the Torah. In fact, there's only one place, really, where this exists. And we don't know whether any of this stuff was ever actually followed. And we'll get to that in a minute. But the point is that until modern times, you don't have a full Jewish discussion of what you might call a theory of war and peace, like you do in Christian sources and Muslim sources. And that's because Jews didn't have sovereignty, they didn't have armies.
They weren't in place to do it.
Right, and even though there were times when Jews participated in warfare as active members, the rabbinic tradition is silent on many of those occasions. Like, you don't find any real discussion of the wars of the Hasmoneans. And you only see discussions of the wars against the Romans really within the context of Jews as victims and martyrs. So when you're talking about the rabbinic tradition, there really is very little there. In fact, Elie Wiesel was once asked to give a talk on Jewish ideas about warfare, and he said, I can't really do it, so I'm going to talk about peace. Because there's a huge amount of material on peace, but not on war. So when you look at the rabbinic material, really they are meant to extrapolate from the narrative parts of the Tanakh, the wars of Joshua and David. And from there, the rabbis create certain categories. Okay, but as I said, there's no evidence for any reaction to the Hasmonean Wars, the Persian Wars, the Romans, and even when you read medieval material, they really don't talk a lot about the Christian and Muslim wars. There's no critical reflection, as one scholar put it, and that's because Jews didn't have a state, they didn't have an army, so they didn't have to deal with the issue. In fact, some modern commentators have pointed out that when you don't have power, you have a certain ethical purity, right? The minute you have power, then you have to deal with this issue. And in fact, that's what happened since the creation of the State of Israel. There is considerable discussion, and this even goes into pre-state, going all the way back to the late 19th century, the issues of Jewish self-defense. When Jews began to form self-defense units in Russia as a response to the pogroms, the rise of the Zionist movement, the creation of a Jewish military units, the Haganah and the Palmach and the pre-states, they created certain principles of warfare, and of course, eventually a full-fledged discussion of war right throughout the history of the State of Israel until this very day. And with every new major conflict in Israel, you have continued discussions about this, both from secular and religious perspectives. So once you have power, and of course that is also true the fact that as Jews have gained political power in countries in the diaspora, especially the United States, you find Jews talking about issues of war and peace in this country. You find there was a considerable amount of ethical writing on the subject during the Vietnam War. and continuing to, occasionally to this day. So a couple of ideas, first of all. When you take a look at the Jewish word for peace, shalom, it means wholeness or perfection. And in the context of the discussions, it means a period of not war. Because the idea seems to be that when you look at biblical texts and even rabbinic texts, that violence seems to be the natural state of things after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And therefore it's normal and endemic. And it's only with the coming of the Messianic era that this normal violence will end again. And actually, the Hebrew word for war, milchama, actually doesn't mean war. It means battles. And therefore, it's the opposite of shalom, which is, as therefore it is, not peace. So that's kind of the theoretical. One of the things that happens, of course, is after the destruction of the Second Temple, the notion of violence and warfare, it colors the Jewish perception of the Gentile wars. So anything dealing with that really is about the Gentiles' wars. Maybe we can have the doors shut, Robert. And so when you're talking about Jewish ideas about war in rabbinic materials, it's an entirely theoretical discussion. And even in Maimonides' day, it's an entirely theoretical discussion. And as you know, the Mishnah Torah being a complete law code, the only one since the Mishnah was a complete law code, the Mishnah Torah in some ways is even more complete. There has never been another law code like the Mishnah Torah that covers absolutely every single area of Jewish law. So naturally, Maimonides is going to deal with this issue. But again, for him in his day, Jews had no army. They had no power. And although, there were a couple of exceptions like Samuel Halevi ibn Negrela, who was the commander of the armies of Grenada, that was a really big exception. And although we know, for example, that Jews during the Crusade attacks, in fact, did, according to Jewish sources, defend themselves. We don't know how historical. It talks about them donning armor and swords and all this. We don't really know how historical those things are. Later on, as the modern nation state arises, Jews begin to participate in modern armies as citizens of their state. But again, this doesn't come out as in Jewish material as a real discussion about warfare until the rise of the State of Israel. Robert, do you have the material for today that I emailed yesterday? Cantor, did you get it?
Mm-hmm. I have it, but I didn't.
Okay, and also there's a little extra thing that an article. Oh, here.
Was it Kings and their War?
Yeah, and this is for. And they probably need these too. Okay. Here. Good morning. So we're going to begin first of all by briefly looking at the biblical sources that Maimonides and the early rabbinic tradition really bases their whole discussion on. And they're both in the book of Deuteronomy. So if you first want to look at Deuteronomy 17, chapter 17, starting in verse 14, you have here the laws of the king. And given the fact that we ascribe the earliest stages of Deuteronomy to the 8th century BCE, the fact is this law code arises within the context of a monarchy, and evidently a critical attitude towards the monarchy, because anything that we can tell from the narrative parts of the Tanakh, from the books of Samuels and Kings, the monarchs had you might say, almost absolute power, and pretty much did what they want. There's no evidence that they were, in fact, subject to any kind of law code, and that their word was law. And you only find the prophets challenging them with a higher authority. So what you're seeing in Deuteronomy, therefore, is an attempt by the Deuteronomic school to limit the power of the king, to put the king under law, precisely to avoid the excesses that they had already experienced. So if you take a look, and we're on page 413 in the Tanakh, first of all, again, given what, the fact that Moses is supposed to say this, it's a bit, anachronistic, because the rest of the Torah does not envision any human king. God is the only king. You'll notice, first of all, in that the law says you can, but God has to choose the king, right? And secondly, they have to be one of your own people. You're not allowed to have a foreign king. And notice in verse 16 it says, moreover, he shall not keep many horses. Now, why that? Because horses were incredibly expensive, and therefore would require a lot of infrastructure and taxation to uphold, or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. That's a little obscure, but you're not supposed to go back to Egypt. By the way, that has implications in some of the discussions that we won't look at about whether you are required to live in the land of Israel, or can you live in the diaspora, and can you live in Egypt at all, okay?
Maybe they bred horses in Egypt.
Yeah, could be, yeah. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray. Now, we know from the Book of Kings that's exactly what happened to Solomon. So this may be sort of what lies in the background. Nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. In other words, that would require heavy taxation. He's only supposed to have the amount of money needed to function. So it limits monarchical spending. And then look at verse 18. When he's seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching. The Deuteronomy is referring, of course, to itself, but later on, the rabbinic tradition says the whole Torah, written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Let it remain with him, and let him read it in his life all his days, so that he may learn to revere the Lord, and so on and so forth. Thus he will not act haughtily towards his fellows, nor deviate from the instruction to the right or the left, to the end that he his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. You see what their point is. Mm-hmm. And the rabbinic tradition says that this literally means that wherever he goes, this Torah scroll has to go with him. They are attempting to rein in the power of the king and put it under the rule of law. And when you actually look at this, it assigns to the king virtually no duties and really limits the king's power, which means this, of course, is a completely idealistic and impractical series of laws given the way kings acted. But you see, but nonetheless, this is one of the texts that rabbinic tradition works with, and that Maimonides, therefore, is working with. Now, the other text is chapter 20, of Deuteronomy, which begins a section on the laws of war. Okay? One of the things you have to understand is that within the context of the Bible, the leader of the forces of Israel is God. And you find many references to God and the heavenly hosts fighting on the side of the Israelites. And in fact, we know from the book of Samuel, they even took the ark into battle with them to represent the presence of God. Deuteronomy tends to play that down a little bit. Deuteronomy doesn't like the ark at all, really, and tends to downplay a bit the sacral nature of it. But notice what it does. There's a law that before each battle, a priest shall go and exhort the people. And then there's supposed to be a formal exhortation starting in verse 5, exempting people from battle. Right? And it gives a list of people who are allowed to be exempt from fighting, including the faint-hearted, meaning people who are afraid. Now, What kind of army, therefore, does this text assume?
Battle hardened, maybe?
A militia, not a standing army. Okay? And that's an interesting point. And in fact, very likely during the time of Saul, for example, there probably was Saul, from what we can tell, only kept a very small number of household troops, professional, which would be full-time soldiers. David expanded that. He had his own royal guard, which were mercenaries, foreign mercenaries, Philistines, interestingly enough. And he had a whole officer structure that started to evolve with Saul, where you have a chief of staff and various commanders. But very likely, even in David's time, the vast majority of David's army was a citizen militia, that he had a core of professional soldiers, and then the rest of the army were the tribal levies as needed. And that, by the way, was the way most nations fought their battles.
Just professional?
Very small number of professionals that that are the core, and then citizen militia. It's very expensive, as we know from our own military budget, to maintain a standing army. And it was especially more expensive in pre-modern times. And so you do have times when there were, usually in most ancient battles, you do have a kind of professional core, but then the average troops are usually some kind of militia. Now, because it really takes a long time to train someone to be a professional soldier before the rise of the rifle. It's relatively easy to teach somebody to shoot a rifle or musket. You need, when you have a cannon, you have to have specialists for that. But in ancient pre-modern warfare, to teach someone to be an archer, they have to start when they're children. And to become a knight, for example, in the Middle Ages, they had to start when they were adolescents, to build up certain muscles and skills. In fact, they have found, by the way, remains of people from the Middle Ages that they can tell whether they were archers because of certain bones that get built up because of the constant pull. And the English longbow was, if you actually tried to, pull today a medieval English longbow, you would not be able to pull it. It required incredible strength built up in one's arms. And likewise, they have also found that in people who were knights, that certain muscles in their sword arm were quite built up. So the idea that somehow a people's militia can go out and do things. So even in the ancient times, they had a professional corps that would provide the backbone of any army.
What about the Roman armies?
That was different. The Romans, they had a standing army. There were times when they had, in the Republican times, they actually did have a draft, but it fell into disuse, so that by late Republican times and the imperial times, they did have a standing army. They were one of the few that did not have that. And again, yes, it took a long time to train people to be legionnaires, to do the kind of tactics that the Romans, that made them so successful, the battle tactics. They also had auxiliary troops that were not legionnaires, that were, warriors of vassal countries who were probably less professional. But yeah, the Romans were, one of the reasons why they were successful is because they managed for hundreds and hundreds of years to maintain a professionally trained army of some size. And a legion was approximately 5,000 men. So, they maintained anywhere from 20 to 30 legions at a time, depending upon the history of what was going on. That's a huge amount of men because then there's all the supplies and the food and everything else that has to be maintained. In addition to which, in addition to the legions in the imperial period, they also had troops fortresses along their borders. So, especially in late imperial times, they had stationary troops that maintained their border forts, and then they had large mobile forces that could be rushed to various points should they be needed. So that thank you for bringing that up, because that is a very different situation than you found later on. But even before the Romans, you did find the rise of in the Hellenistic period of mercenary armies, where you had people who became professional soldiers who then hired themselves out. And again, because they were professionals, they were easy to they defeated a lot of armies. And the Greek hoplite, for example, arising out of the wars, in Greece, became a standardized mercenary even before Alexander the Great.
The Greek what?
Hoplite, which is the term for the Greek infantry soldier with who had a metal helmet, a metal breastplate, metal greaves, a shield, and a very large spear, the phalanx. To create the phalanx, which was like a bristling formation of shields with spears coming out, that required a lot of training to be able to do that. And they also carried swords. Okay? The Romans created a lot more mobile infantry structure than the phalanx.
Of course, to have a standing army, you have to have a society with plenty of resources.
Yeah.
Excess resources to be able to afford it. Although I guess these people probably, the army was paid in what they grabbed when they invaded areas.
The Roman legions actually were paid a salary, but also when they retired, they were often given land to farm on. But you're right. It requires a centralized state with a taxation system. You have to have the ability to manufacture the weapons. So you have to have, in effect, you have to have factories to produce the weaponry in large amounts. You have, it's one of the reasons why the Romans established their road system to make it easy for their troops to go from one place to another. So again, what you see in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, has been a long kind of divergence, is not a professional army. It is a citizen militia. And you see this in the narrative parts of the Tanakh, that they call up the tribal levies. So now, in verse 10, it talks about what happens. So first of all, you get rid of anybody who is exempt and people who are faint-hearted. And then in verse 10 to 14, it talks about what happens when you come up to a city to attack it. And a large part of ancient warfare were not battles in the open, but very often sieges, where an army would go and lay siege to a town and the town would resist, and so on and so forth. If it responds peacefully and lets you in, all the people present there shall serve you at forced labor. This is assuming an attack on a foreign town. It seems to be outside the land of Israel, and so the people become forced labor. If it does not surrender to you, but would join battle with you, you shall lay siege to it. And when the Lord your God delivers it, you shall put all the males to the sword. Now, this was not an unusual practice in ancient times, where whole populations would be slaughtered by conquering armies. The Romans in particular did it to rebellious provinces or rebellious areas. They would literally come in and as punishment for the rebellion, they would basically massacre everybody. Okay?
All the males or everybody?
Everybody. Okay? It was not an unusual practice. You may, however, take as your booty the women, the children, and so on and so forth. Okay. So then it says, in verse 15, thus you shall deal with all the towns that lie very far from you. In other words, this envisions beyond the border attack. However, within the land of Israel, all of the nations, the various Canaanite nations, when you conquer them, they all have to be killed. Okay? Now, this has been mentioned in Exodus and other parts of Deuteronomy. And again, this was not an unusual practice. The rationale in Deuteronomy is that these people are not just idolaters, but they practice really terrible things like child sacrifice and all kinds of other stuff. And in order to make sure that you are not influenced by them, you're supposed to wipe them out. Now, by the time of the writing of Deuteronomy, of course, there were no real Canaanites around to that extent. And there's been a lot of discussion of, is this entirely theoretical or did this actually happen? There is some evidence from the period of the Israelite conquest or wars that there may have been some of this, but there really is no evidence for this in any wide-scale way. And some scholars believe that the authors of Deuteronomy looked around, didn't see any Canaanites around, because what happened to the Canaanite population? They actually got absorbed into the Israelite population, very likely. They looked around, they didn't see any Canaanites, and they made the assumption this is what happened. Okay? So, while it is true that this practice has happened in ancient times, we really have equivocal evidence as to whether this actually happened. And by the way, because the notion that God is fighting on your side, and you're supposed to wipe out all of the foreigners, this has given rise, as you will see, to discussion whether this is a Jewish concept of holy war. Okay, now there is no such term in Jewish sources, but it has been discussed in modern sources. Is do classical Jewish sources envision what we would call a holy war or a kind of jihad, which we'll get to. Now, in verse 19, this is the famous text for environmentalism, that you're not supposed to destroy food trees. This is an attempt to limit environmental damage, which warfare is one of the most environmentally damaging activities to humans. So that's pretty well it. There's also a section later on that what happens if you go to war. And there's some also, like in chapter 23, there's a little bit about purity laws during warfare, making sure that the latrine is outside the camp. There's also a little bit about what happens with foreign female captives and how you're supposed to treat them, whether they're concubines or wives and that sort of thing. But aside from that, that's it. Okay.
Where's the one about the latrine?
That's in
11. That's 23:11.
Yeah, I think that's 23:11. Yeah. Well, it starts in 23:10. Actually, it starts with nocturnal emissions and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, so then so let's then take a look at what the rabbis do with this material. And if you look here at the material that I gave you, either sent you or gave you now, on page 1, you'll see that in the Mishnah, they discuss the text regarding the exemptions. This is that we saw in Deuteronomy 20. In other words, the list of people who are exempted from warfare. Okay? So the Mishnah, take a look on page 1. Suzanne, do you want to read it?
Mishnah 8:7.
Yeah, this is from the tractate Sota.
Okay. To what does all the foregoing apply? Voluntary wars, but in the wars commanded by the Torah, all go forth, even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her canopy.
Okay, so right away, the rabbis are now creating two categories of warfare. What they call reshut, voluntary warfare, and warfare which is a mitzvah. In other words, the wars commanded by God against the nations of the Canaanite, no exemptions are permitted. Everybody goes to fight, including women apparently. What is a voluntary war? Well, we'll find out. But they've introduced now two categories of warfare. Read on. Rabbi Judah says.
Rabbi Judah says, to what does all the foregoing apply? To the wars commanded by the Torah, but in obligatory wars, all go forth, even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her canopy.
Rabbi Judah introduces a third category, chovah, obligatory. So you've got voluntary, reshut, mitzvah, commandment, and chovah, obligatory. So what does these three things mean? Well, here's the discussion in the Gemara. Read on, Suzanne.
To what does all the foregoing apply? To voluntary wars and so on. Rabbi Yochanan said, a war which is designated voluntary according to the rabbis is commanded according to Rabbi Judah, and a war which is designated commanded according to the rabbis is obligatory according to Rabbi Judah.
They're trying to reconcile the two opinions. Okay, so go on. Rabbah said,
Rabbah said, the wars waged by Joshua to conquer Canaan were obligatory in the opinion of all. The wars waged by the house of David for territorial expansion were voluntary in the opinion of all. Where they differ is with regard to wars against heathens, so that these should not march against them. One calls them commanded and the other voluntary. The practical issue being that one who is engaged in the performance of a commandment is exempt from the performance of another commandment.
okay, so commanded wars, in fact, are the ones that God commands. The obligatory wars are ones that are self-defense, ultimately, and voluntary wars are imperial wars of expansion. Okay?
They get to it in the Sota of all places.
Yeah.
Why is it there?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I mean, I'm looking back a little.
Yeah. So the Sota is, of course, it starts with the laws of the woman who's suspected of adultery.
But he's on page 44.
Yeah, exactly. But the like the Mishnah, does connect it, maybe because it has connection with the bridegroom and that sort of thing. All right, but now take a look at Mishnah Sanhedrin. So here is where the rabbinic law is building on the laws of the king. Okay, in other words, remember in Deuteronomy, the king is given very little actual power, but in reality, we know that kings have absolute power because they have an army to back them up. Okay, so Irma, you want to read this Mishnah first of all? This is from Tractate Sanhedrin.
He, the king, may lead forth the host to a voluntary war on the decision of a court of 71. He may force a way through private property, and none may oppose him. There is no limitation to the king's way. The plunder taken by the people in war must be given to him, and he receives the first choice when it is divided.
Okay, so you learn two things from here. Number one, that according to the rabbis, and they're picking this up from Deuteronomy, the king has to get the permission of the Sanhedrin to go on an imperial war. Now, we know that never happened. Okay? Okay?
If he's all powerful, he doesn't have to get permission.
Well, exactly, but the rabbis following the same ideology as Deuteronomy want to limit the power of the king. Okay? That's why they say this. Right? There's never any occasion that a king just, called together a Sanhedrin and said, oh, by the way, if they wanted to go and they had his followers backed him, they went. Now notice, once the king goes on war, he's got absolute power. He can push through private property, march through private property. There's no limitation. The king has absolute power in wartime, right? And when the plunder is taken, he gets first. All right, now take a look at the Gemara. Read that.
We have already once learned it. A voluntary war may be declared only by the permission of a court of 71. As the Tana deals with all matters pertaining to the king, he also states the law concerning the declaration of a voluntary war. Rav Judah said in Samuel's name, all that is set out in the chapter dealing with the actions of a king he is permitted to do. Rav said, that chapter was intended only to inspire them with awe, for it is written, thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee. His awe should be over thee.
Yeah, and this is given the rules that Maimonides explicates quite clearly that nobody has the right to. What's interesting is that there's this delicate dance between the king is under the law of the Sanhedrin and the law of the Torah. On the other hand, the king seems to also have absolute power, that people cannot oppose the king's will. So that's the background to Maimonides' discussion. Again, Maimonides' discussion is entirely theoretical. But the critical point for us is that in modern Israel, the discussion of Maimonides no longer becomes theoretical. Okay? Because some people hold, even though in his own day Maimonides was opposed by people and he wasn't seen by some other rabbinical authorities as the supreme authority. There are people today who take Maimonides' Mishnah Torah almost as if it is divine revelation, accord it an authority that is almost absolute. All right? And that becomes problematic when Maimonides discusses the laws, the wars, the commanded wars against the Canaanites. Okay? But take a look now. Go to our books on page 215. We're going to skim some of this. He talks about, first of all, that, interestingly enough, that you're only supposed to create a king when you've already entered the land, which of course, and he talks about 3 commandments. And notice he talks about, first of all, he says he thinks that the creation of the kingship was a mitzvah, that it was, you had to do it, whereas the Torah, Deuteronomy's implication seems to suggest if you decide to do it, Maimonides in effect saying is you must do it. Secondly, it's to destroy the Amalekites, right? And thirdly, to build the temple. So he sees those as 3 commandments that only come into play once you enter the land of Israel. And then he talks about how you're supposed to appoint a king before you wipe out Amalek, because of course Saul becomes king before the wars against the Amalekites. Okay? He deals, by the way, in the second paragraph on page 216 of number 2, about the problem in the book of Samuel's where it seems that God is unhappy with the people for wanting a king. Okay? He here is reflecting the rabbinic tradition, which tries to reconcile all these things, saying it's not that the request was wrong, but the way they did it.
Do you think Maimonides was aware of the fact that some things are not so, they don't gel together in the Torah, or he was like an old-fashioned that way?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that, he has to accept the rabbinic tradition as it is. I mean, when you get to his philosophical discussion, of course, he's going to radically depart from the meaning of certain things. And, if you were to compare, rabbinic spirituality with Maimonides' spirituality, the conceptions of God, they're very different. But on a halachic basis, he's pretty straightforward on this. It's pretty straightforward.
Because the definition of Amalek even is so
Yeah, exactly.
obscure.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think I think in his own day, he would have felt the Amalekites were all gone, the Canaanites were all gone. He did not apply these rules to Muslims and Christians, okay, in his own day. The problem in the modern day is then when people redefine non-Jews as being on the same level as Canaanites, that becomes the problem, okay? All right, so in chapter 2, the selection here is he talks about how the king should be in character, right? And notice that the king is supposed to be like a sage, of humble and lowly spirit. In other words, he's not supposed to be arrogant. He's supposed to be like Moses. Well, we know that kings are not usually like that, okay? And then in chapter 3 on page 217, he deals with the issue of the king having the Torah scroll. So, George, you want to read the first chapter?
Which halacha you want?
Chapter 3, number 1, page 217. This is in the book.
Yeah, but which halacha?
Chapter 3.
Book 14.
Go ahead, George.
As soon as the king ascends the throne, he must write a scroll of the law for himself, in addition to the one which his ancestors have left him. He is to have it corrected by the court of 71 from the scroll in the temple.
Notice he's supposed to write it himself. Now, there is the mitzvah, the 613th mitzvah in the Torah, according to the rabbis, is everybody's supposed to write a Torah scroll. But we all fulfill that by having a sofer finish a letter for us when it's, But in effect, Maimonides is saying that law applies literally to the king, whereas the Torah seems to suggest it's written for him. Here, he's saying he's got to write it himself. Of course, he's going to have earlier ones that were, handed down to him, read on if his father
If his father left him no scroll or it was lost, he must write 2 copies, one the writing of which is obligatory upon every Jew. He shall place in his treasure house, and the other is to be with him all the time, except when he enters the privy or bathhouse, or any other place where it is improper to read.
So, in other words, if the king didn't get an inherited Torah scroll, he has to do 2. One as a Jew and one as a king. Go on.
When he goes forth to war, it shall be with him. When he returns from war, it shall be with him. When he sits in judgment, it shall be with him. And when he sits down to eat, it shall be before him, as it is said, and it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life.
Now we know this never happened, okay? But the rabbinic tradition picking up on the underlying ideology of Deuteronomy is the king must be subject to the Torah. The king is not an absolute authority. They give the king a lot of authority, but not absolute authority.
You know, today is a fundraiser. All these schools and shuls are having people pay to have a scribe help them.
Yeah, exactly.
Write a letter.
Yeah, exactly.
And it goes back to this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember when I was a kid in our synagogue, we had a new Torah scroll, and you went up and you told the sofer what your Hebrew name was, and he went and he looked for a letter, and he filled it in. He didn't write the letter, he filled it in. And that, therefore, you fulfilled the mitzvah of writing a Torah scroll, okay? I mean, that's what is usually done today, since most people, 99.9% of us don't know how to write a Torah scroll, you know? But that's what you do. All right, and you'll notice in 5 and 6, he picks up stuff from other places that he's not supposed to be a drunkard.
Well,
Okay.
no, there's drunkard, but it's not for him to drink wine. There's a big difference.
Yeah, but he's interpreting it to mean overly. Okay, and of course he has to be a Torah sage, right? And for Maimonides, the perfect king must be a Torah sage and therefore also a philosopher, right? And then notice in
And he's
6.
also, but as you say, he has to be all these things, but he also has greater power than it would seem he would have from Deuteronomy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In other words, the rabbinic tradition actually affords the king a lot more power than Deuteronomy seems to, because Deuteronomy doesn't tell, you know, if you followed the laws of kingship in Deuteronomy, the king is like a ceremonial, you know, kind of head, but doesn't really do much.
Praise.
And notice he's not allowed to indulge in sexual excess, right?
Excess, with the emphasis on excess.
Right, and he is allowed to have concubines, okay? This because it's obvious that kings could have concubines. But even if he only has one wife, he's not supposed to be, you know, involved too much more in sex. All right? What's interesting is, of course, in Spain, I don't know, there was an issue, by the way. There was concubinage amongst Jews in Spain. There wasn't in Ashkenaz. So it was actually the issue of concubines were actually a real live issue among Spanish Jews. I don't know if in Maimonides' day, but certainly later there was a real attempt by certain rabbinic authorities to stop wealthy Jews from having concubines. But
And multiple wives.
no, not multiple wives.
But
Sephardic Jews
concubines.
did not have multiple wives, although Jewish law permitted Jews to have more than one wife. It was only in Ashkenaz that they began the process of forbidding it, and that practice eventually spread through most of the Jewish world. But in Yemen, Jews did sometimes have more than one wife. Sometimes a man took another wife because his first wife was infertile, and he didn't want to divorce her. And that went all the way up to the 20th century, by the way.
They came to Israel, I think.
Yeah, some of the Yemenites came to Israel with 2 wives, and they grandfathered them in. They said they're allowed to keep them, but nobody after that. But in Spain, it seems that there were concubines. Okay? All right, so notice chapter 4. George, you want to start reading there?
It is within the province of the king to levy taxes upon the people for his own needs or for war purposes. He fixes the customs duties, and it is forbidden to evade them. He may issue a decree that whoever dodges them shall be punished either by confiscation of his property or by death, as it is written, and you shall be his servants. Elsewhere it is said, all the people found therein shall be tributary to you, and shall serve you. From these verses, we infer that the king imposes taxes and fixes customs duties, and that all the laws enacted by him with regard to these and like matters are valid, for it is his prerogative to exercise all the authority set forth in the section relating to the king.
Now, we know that those, in fact, were the ways in which ancient states raised monies. There were various forms of taxation, not what we would call income taxes probably, but, poll taxes and taxes on various things. We know, we discussed how the Jewish community had a tax on meat. That when you went to the shochet, there was a community tax on kosher meat. But we know that the large part of the money that rulers got in the Middle Ages came from custom duties. In other words, goods coming into their territory. So that merchants when they came in with their goods, were assessed a certain percentage, and sometimes that could be considerable, in order to be able to bring the goods in and to sell it, right? So that's where the vast majority of income came from in the medieval period. So Maimonides is kind of reflecting his own time. And of course, that was all factored into the cost of the goods, by the way, right?
Well, it's always been an easy way, a politically easy way to assess taxes.
Absolutely.
On stuff from someone else.
Well, yeah, exactly. And, and it was very lucrative too, especially since a lot of trade was in luxury items, right? Which were high cost to begin with, right? So in other words, most of the trading for the Jewish traders who went to India came back with was in spices, jewelry, silk, things like that. It wasn't in large scale things like iron and, metal or agricultural goods. It was in stuff that was difficult to get. Now, there was some of these metal, gold, silver, slaves were also a commodity that was traded in Maimonides' day, undoubtedly from one part of the empire to the other. Things like iron were traded and so on, or lead, or various other kinds of metals that might not be available in one place. But most stuff was, most of the things that people used were quite localized, right? It was only the stuff that you didn't have in your area that you traded for. And the longer the trading, you obviously want the stuff to be as portable as possible, which is one of the reasons why jewels were a very good thing to trade for, because they're so easy to carry, right? And hide, by the way. Okay. Notice it says in number 10, all the land he conquers belong to him. In a voluntary war of imperial expansion, the king owns all of the land that is conquered. And now he can give it to whoever he wants. But in all these matters, he is the final arbiter. But whatever he does should be done by him for the sake of heaven. In other words, the king should be pious. And whatever he does, he says his sole aim and thought should be to uplift the true religion, to fill the word with righteousness, to break the arm of the wicked, and to fight the battles of the Lord. So, Maimonides has a very exalted notion of what the king should be. Okay, so let's go back to the material that I just gave you, because...
Interesting, he says that one of the two things is to wage war.
Yes.
The role of the king is
The role of the king is to wage war. That is the primary role. And you see this in the book of Samuel. Why do the Israelites want to have a king? To wage war for them, to be their war leader. Because in the period of the judges, there was no permanent war leader. When they needed to fight, a shofet, a judge, would arise, who was not a judge in the sense of the English word, but a charismatic war leader. And his victory in battle then conferred upon him authority to be an arbiter. So the king was a permanent war leader who would, and of course in those days the king had to be in the front, had to actually go out with his armies. And King David did until he got old, and then that's kind of a sign of his decline, that he no longer goes out to fight, that he has other people do it for him. And that's a sign of weakness, of course, in the king, that he's no longer powerful enough to do that. But yes, that's the primary function of a king, and second, to keep the peace, and secondly, to be a judge. That is the purpose of a king. All right, so let's take a look now on page 2 of the material I gave you. And this is dealing with this issue of the obligatory war, the mitzvah war, how Maimonides codifies it. All right, and this is chapter 5, halacha 1. Robert, you want to read?
Irma's not reading today?
What? Irma already read.
You slept through my reading?
A king should not wage other wars before a melech hamet mitzvah. What is considered as a melech hamet mitzvah? The war against 7 nations who occupied Eretz Yisrael, the war against
Amalek.
and a war fought to assist Israel from an enemy which attacks them. Afterwards, he may wage a melech hamet harashit, a war fought with other nations in order to expand the borders of Israel or magnify its greatness and reputation.
Now, notice he is making basically 2 categories, right? He is saying that a milchemet mitzvah is the commanded wars of God against the nations within the Canaan. Secondly, a defensive war.
He's the first one using those terms.
No. That's in the Talmud.
In the Talmud.
But he is conflating the milchemet chova, the obligatory war, into the milchemet mitzvah, right? He's not separating the two into separate categories. He's conflating the two together. So for him, he has the milchemet mitzvah. It is a commandment to defend yourself, right? You can see that as a sort of a national expression of pikuach nefesh, right? And a defensive war, by the way, can be preemptive if if you're going to be attacked. So, but the second one, the voluntary war, is the one of imperial expansion.
That's the parachute?
Yeah, milchemet
That's the
harashut.
expansion one.
Right. All right, read number 2.
There is no need to seek the permission of the court to wage a melech hamet mitzvah. Rather, he may go out on his own volition and force the nation to go out with him. In contrast, he may not lead the nation out to wage a war of melech hamet harashut unless the court of 71 judges approves.
So he is reflecting the Talmud here, that imperial wars of a territorial expansion must come with the authority of the Sanhedrin. All right?
And he is lowering himself with the Sanhedrin above him.
Yes, exactly. That when it comes to the issue of warfare that is not necessary warfare, either self-defense or ones about killing off the nations, he is subject to a higher law. But of course, we know that never happened,
Why do we know that?
because there's no evidence that any king of ancient Israel ever asked any legislative body for permission to do whatever he wanted.
You mean from the Bible you're talking
Yeah, and certainly the Hasmoneans never did it, and King Herod never did it. And once you have that, after the end of that, there are no kings, right? Except for a few, Herod Agrippa II, but leave that aside. All right, read number 4.
It is a positive commandment to annihilate the 7 nations who dwelt in Eretz Yisrael, as Deuteronomy states, you shall utterly destroy them. Anyone who chances upon one of them and does not kill him violates a negative commandment, as 16 states, do not allow a soul to live. The memory of them has already been obliterated.
What he means by that is they don't exist anymore.
So it doesn't apply to anything
This,
anymore.
exactly.
So what?
It doesn't apply to anybody anymore. They're gone, right? Maimonides recognized there were no Canaanites in his day.
Well, and he's also saying that you can't conflate that with somebody else.
Yeah,
You can't say, well, they're like the Canaanites, so we're going to go and
exactly.
obliterate them.
Exactly. That's an important thing, by the way. And by the way, when you get discussions of other authorities about the status of Christianity and Islam, one of the ways, especially with regard to Christianity, is they say, well, they're not like and even pagans in some cases, they're not like the pagans of ancient Israel. They're different. That's why we're allowed to do business with them, right? This is very important for all kinds of areas of medieval relations.
Which letter was that?
That was Halacha 4, according to the translation I'm using.
Okay.
All right, read number 6.
All the lands which Israel conquers in wars led by a king and approved by the court are considered as conquered by the people at large. Thus, they have the same status as Eretz Yisrael, which was conquered by Joshua in every regard. This only applies if they were conquered after the conquest of Eretz Yisrael as described in the Torah.
In other words, once the king conquers some land, it is now on the same level in terms of all laws as Eretz Yisrael, right? There are the traditional borders of Eretz Yisrael, and if the king goes beyond those borders, again, what is this all about? This is about the law, the conquest of David. This is about to try and incorporate the conquests of David within the rabbinic legal system, because David obviously went on wars of foreign conquest. He conquered the Moabites, the Midianites, the Edomites, the Aram. I mean, he conquered the Philistines. In other words, David created, let's take the Bible's word for it for the moment. We don't know whether actually historically this is true or not, but according to the Bible, David created a medium-sized empire in the region, right? Which was maintained under Solomon and only, started to decline after Solomon. So the fact is David went on some serious wars of imperial attack. And the rabbis looking at those, whereas Joshua, of course, only conquered the land of Israel. So they are trying to incorporate David's actions within the context of their legal system. And Maimonides, of course, is reflecting that. Okay. All right. Read one more, Robert.
War,
Chapter 6, number 1.
War, neither a Melech-Hamed Harashut or a Melech-Hamed Mitzvah, should not be waged against anyone until they are offered the opportunity of peace. As Deuteronomy states, when you approach a city to wage war against it, you should propose a peaceful settlement. If the enemy accepts the offer of peace and commits itself to the fulfillment of the 7 mitzvot that were commanded by Noah's descendants, none of them should be killed. Rather, they should be subjugated, as Deuteronomy states, they shall be your subjects and serve you. If they agree to tribute, but do not accept subjugation, or if they accept subjugation, but do not agree to tribute, their offer should not be heeded.
Okay, stop there for a second. Stop there for a second. Notice what he's saying here. This is a very interesting departure, right? If you take the rules, at face value, you're supposed to wipe out the Canaanites, right? Notice he says in Halakha 4, it's a positive commandment to wipe them out. Here, he's saying a Melchemet Mitzvah, which I assume he must mean a war of self-defense, right? He is saying you don't wipe them out, you have to offer peace first. Now, we saw that in Deuteronomy, you do that, right? Okay? And notice what he says, accepts the offer of peace and commits itself to the fulfillment of the 7 mitzvot that were commanded to Noah's descendants. That's not in the Torah, obviously. What are the 7 commandments? These are the laws that the rabbis derived from the story of Adam and Noah that are considered the basic moral laws that are incumbent upon all humanity. And if a Gentile does those 7 mitzvot, then they are considered a righteous Gentile. So Maimonides adds this to the subjugation of these peoples.
What are those 7 mitzvahs?
Well, he goes into great detail. There's a whole thing about them, and actually in the rabbinic discussion there's a little bit of disagreement about that, but essentially they are, first of all, not to worship idols, in other words, to be monotheists, not to eat the flesh of a living animal, to rip off a limb, not to engage in sexual crimes, not to kill, not to steal, and to have law courts. I think that's 7.
Appoint judges or something.
That's what I said. You have to appoint judges. You have to have a legal system. Okay, and he, in this part of the Mishnah Torah, is where he goes on and discusses all of that, which we're going to take a look at a little bit. Okay, all right. Read on, but notice they've got to accept subjugation and to give tribute.
They must accept both.
Right.
And this has to be in the land of Israel, all this stuff.
No,
You
this
can go to
Milchemet
Africa
HaRashut is outside the land of
So
Israel.
you can go to Africa and do the same.
Yeah, exactly. And I think here he means, when he sees Milchemet Mitzvah, I think he's talking about wars of self-defense, because he's already talked about the fact that Canaanites have to be annihilated. So, and according to the Torah, you're not allowed to give them this choice, the 7 nations. Go on.
Oh, you're passing the word self.
No.
Very carefully.
No. I'm saying he in the Talmudic text. One rabbi introduces the notion of chovah, obligatory, as opposed to mitzvah, commanded. But he is putting chovah, which is self-defense, into the category of mitzvah, precisely because of the notion, I think, of the law of self-defense. Right?
Well,
Go on. The
as long
subject.
as my objection is noted.
Okay. Yes. The subjection.
The subjugation they must accept consists of being on a lower level, scorned and humble. They must never raise their heads against Israel. They must remain subjugated under their rule. They may never be appointed over Jew in any matter whatsoever.
Now, you notice, this is exactly the way the Jews were under Islam. In other words, he basically, it's the same thing, right? We're second-class citizens to the ruling power. Therefore, if we become the ruling power, we have the right to make people second-class citizens. Okay, go on.
The tribute they must accept consists of being prepared to support the king's service with their money and with their persons. For example, the building of walls, strengthening of fortresses, building the king's palace, and the like, as in kings.
And so then he quotes from there, and in the last sentence he says, Solomon did not make bondsmen out of the children of Israel. They were men of wars, personal servants, princes, and so on and so forth. I'm not so sure about that. In other words, there were oftentimes one of the ways that kings tax the people was through physical labor. In other words, building things, harvesting the king's fields, and so on, that they had to give a certain amount of his time. That was apparently how all of the big structures in Egypt were built, not by slaves, but by Egyptians who had to give a certain amount of labor to the pharaoh every year in order to that was a form of taxation with your own body, right?
Corvée? They call that the corvée.
Corvée, exactly. Okay, let's do number 4 now.
Me?
Yeah.
If they do not accept to a peaceful settlement, or if they agree to a peaceful settlement but refuse to accept the 7 mitzvot, war should be raised against them. All males past majority should be killed. Their money and their children should be taken as spoil, but neither the woman or the children should be killed, as Deuteronomy states, but the woman and children take as spoil. The children refers to male below the age of majority. The above applies to a Milchemet HaRashut, fought with other nations. However, if either the 7 nations or Amalek refuse to accept a peaceful settlement, not one soul of them may be left alive, as Deuteronomy states. Do this to all the cities that are not the cities of these nations. However, from the cities of these nations, do not leave a soul alive. Similarly, in regard to Amalek, Deuteronomy states, obliterate the memory of Amalek. How do we know that these commandments are only referring to those who do not accept a peaceful settlement? Joshua states, there are no cities which accepted a peaceful citizens' settlement with the children of Israel except the Hivites who lived in Gibeon. All the rest they conquered in battle. This was inspired by God, who strengthened their hearts to engage in battle against Israel so that they would be destroyed. Oh, that's interesting. From these statements we can infer that a peaceful settlement was offered, but they did not accept
Now
it.
here he seems to be contradicting number 4 in the previous chapter, right? In the previous chapter in Halakha 4, this is on page 2 of what I've given you, it seems that you must annihilate the 7 nations of the Canaanites. Here he is saying, and he's basing it on this text in Joshua, right, which clearly says that a certain group of Canaanites submitted to Israelite rule rather than fight against them. He in effect saying is, even the 7 nations, if they agree to submit, you don't wipe them all out. Now that seems to be really contrary to the actual meaning of the text in Deuteronomy, but he's trying to balance the text in Joshua, which suggests that there were a group of Hivites who did, in fact, submit and therefore were let to live, as opposed to those who refused to submit. So that in itself is quite interesting, that Maimonides is limiting that law in number 4.
I would suggest it was a post hoc ergo propter hoc. There were some Hivites left, and therefore he assumed they still existed.
Well,
Therefore
you mean when the book of Joshua was written, there were still Hivites around?
I think the way he's approaching, the way Maimonides is approaching it is, there were evidence that all of the other Canaanites had disappeared. The Hivites hadn't, therefore they must
Well,
have,
he wouldn't have known that because there weren't any Hivites in his day, right? In Maimonides' day. No, there weren't. There weren't anybody left from that period. That was too long before.
you think you just pull this out of the air?
No, I think what happened is in the time when the book of Joshua was edited, there were probably Hivites around. All right? In other words,
And his reading of Joshua reveals these guys who survived.
yeah, well, because it says so in the book of Joshua. So this conflicts with the law and the Torah. And by the way, the Joshua text is probably earlier than the text in the law of the Torah.
Oh,
Right?
really?
Yeah, probably.
But,
Yeah.
But over and above everything else, he's denying a fundamental commandment. Thou shalt not kill.
No, it says thou shalt not murder, and the Torah permits killing in certain circumstances, and one of the things that the Torah definitely commits is the wiping out of the Canaanites in the land of Israel. It's very specific about that. But Maimonides appears to be limiting that. Okay? Now, before we go back to the text, as I said, this has become a real issue in Israel today. And there have been many discussions about, does the concept of a holy war exist in Judaism? And some people have read Maimonides to, in effect, be a concept of Jewish holy war. The problem is the term doesn't exist, and there actually a great deal of interesting discussions done probably more than 20 years ago on this issue. But there's a whole history of this stuff. One of the people who has actually written about this quite a bit is Ruvain Firestone, and this is a short piece that he wrote for Shema. But if you're interested, I can send you a longer article that he wrote for a journal. I'll send it out to you, where he goes through all of the discussions about the issue of Jewish concepts of war in the modern, both traditionally and in the modern period, from the pre 48 until this day. This is a kind of very short little piece he talks about that he wrote for Shema. It was a theme issue in Shema in 2001 on the issue of war, and he because this was of course people talking about Al Qaeda and jihad and so on and so forth, and if you take a look on the second page on the back, he is saying people are accusing all the Muslims of doing jihad. He says, let us put our own house in order, right? Holy war has been revived among Israel, the people, and within Israel, the state. Okay? Why is Milchemet Mitzvah / Chova obligatory war? Because God the commander requires it. Is it not a holy act to carry out God's command? Is there not an essence of Kedusha, holiness, in the fulfillment of every mitzvah? In other words, he's saying, don't be so quick to criticize Muslims when we have to look in our own texts about whether we have, even if we don't use the term, something that could be called a concept of holy war. And he tries, first of all, to put the Mishnaic laws, right? They were, in historical context, they were attempting to define and dismiss a dangerous phenomena that had twice in their memory brought devastation to the Jewish people. The Great Revolt of 66 and the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132. Two of the most horrific and catastrophic events the Jewish people ever did were driven by Jewish holy war ideas. So the rabbis were trying to limit this idea because they had, according to Firestone, because they had lived through the disastrous consequences of people who proclaimed holy war. Okay? Right? He says, after the Mishnah, Jewish holy war ideas lay virtually dormant for most of our exilic existence, although they were discussed briefly by certain medieval thinkers and appear in some of our apocalyptic and messianic writings. So again, it's completely theoretical, but then he says it's been revived in contemporary Israel, especially amongst ultranationalist Orthodox settlers in Judea and Samaria and their many supporters.
And they're writing books about it.
Exactly. So what you find is that in the settler ideology, they have redefined the Palestinians as the 7 nations of Canaan. Mm-hmm. They have seen the obligation to reclaim the whole land of Israel as a, as he says, as a prelude to the messianic stuff. And in effect, he says it's Jewish holy war. He says further down, a Jewish holy war has entered religious and political discourse in relation to Israel-Palestine conflict. So is the increase of Jewish atrocities in the name of a higher cause. And you see this, he says it reached its peak in the 1980s and mid-1990s. So in other words, he is claiming that we have to recognize that there is this strain within our tradition, and we have to eradicate it. Again, this is not so much a scholarly piece as a very much an opinion piece. If you want the scholarly article, I will send it to you. It's about a 10-15 page article filled with notes and sources and so on, including all the modern stuff up until fairly recently. Like he doesn't go right down to the present day in the scholarly article, but the fact is that this is still a live issue today.
But it's a minority. It's not.
Yes.
It's not a prevailing voice.
No, it's not a prevailing voice. But Maimonides is being quoted as some of the authority for all of this behavior.
As a matter of fact, I'll tell you something. We have a very close friend who is a very political artist in Israel, and he's very well known.
Yep.
Very political. Everything he does, he's very left wing, and he now got to do an exhibit in the beginning of the summer in the Tel Aviv Museum, which is one of them prestigious spots. And we were just there, and he told us that one of the rooms will have a video going on of he goes every Friday to demonstrate in the Arab villages by the wall, by the big wall, against the wall with the Palestinians, and the police comes and arrests them, that kind of thing. But in the Tel Aviv Museum, there's going to be a video. He videotapes it while they're demonstrating.
Demonstration.
Yeah, and it's going to be playing while the Tel Aviv Museum is going to do a retrospective of his with a catalog. I mean, he's going to get real permission to voice it, and I think it's great.
Well, there was also a Palestinian filmmaker did a documentary fairly recently called something like 16 Cameras or
Okay, yep.
Yeah.
Oh,
Broken Cameras, where he went and also did this, and every time the soldiers would come and smash his camera, and then he'd get another one, okay, and do it again. So, there in Israel, there is, of course, especially amongst the secular population, but not just the secular population, many, people in the modern Orthodox, especially out of the whole Hartman Institute, have really said, look, now that we have, the late David Hartman and the Hartman Institute has focused a lot, ever since David Hartman moved to Israel after the 1967 war, has focused on the issue of Jewish power and the ethics of what you must do as a nation, as a people, now that you have power. And he's not the only one who's written on this. I think there's some very interesting writing that has come out in the last 30 or, well, actually even going back to the 50s. Yeshayahu Leibovich wrote about this after there was a massacre that occurred, a retaliatory massacre in the 1950s. There were raids across the border from what we call the West Bank into Israel beyond what is now called the Green Line by Palestinian fighters, and the Israelis would send people across the border to retaliate. And in one case, there was a village where there were a number of civilians who were killed, and there was a lot of controversy about it. And Leibovich wrote a very famous article about this, decrying, what had happened to. And again, discussing, when we didn't have power, we had, kind of this we had an ethical luxury, that we couldn't do anything. But now that we do, we can do this, and we should be really worried about ourselves that we are teaching our young people that this is okay. And this was back in the early 50s he was writing this. So this is a discussion that has been going on for a long, long time. Yes, Robert?
When we were reading chapter 6,
Yeah,
Halacha 1,
yeah.
I said, and you did not accept it, that I did not accept the Melech mitzvah could be here defined as a war of self-defense.
Right.
And the reason I come back to it is because of exactly what is now going on in Israel and the West Bank. The fact is, if you accept that definition, that not ordered by God but a war of self-defense, then you can justify what is going on in the West Bank now. And that's why I said, although I read on, I said, as long as my objection is noted. Because I want to make it perfectly clear. I think that what these people are doing in the West Bank is one of the potentially most destructive things
Absolutely.
for the land of Israel.
I agree with you 100%. What I'm trying to say is if you go back to the Mishnah on the first page, what I gave you, where you have a division between Rabbi Judah and the rabbis, like the anonymous opinion which constitutes the majority, there they talk about two kinds of wars, voluntary war and commanded war, right? Rabbi Judah introduces the category of obligatory war, right? So he's introduced a third category. Some people discuss those as separate categories, that voluntary are imperialistic, mitzvah are the ones specifically commanded against the Canaanites, and obligatory are the wars of self-defense, right? In other words, that just as pikuach nefesh, you're supposed to do everything to save a life. So some people parse this as three separate kinds of war, and that there is no milchemet mitzvah anymore because the Canaanites don't exist. However, some conflate the mitzvah and the chova, the obligatory, and say it is a category that includes the commanded wars against the Canaanites and a war of self-defense.
It is not
Okay.
the first time I disagree with some of them,
No,
and it will not be the last.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that's what happens, and what Maimonides is doing is he's conflating the self-defense war and the war commanded against the Canaanites, okay?
Well, your objection is that once you start talking about self-defense, who knows where you're going to go from there? Is that it?
That's exactly where I'm at.
Except,
That you can justify what is not justifiable by stating it is self-defense.
yes, but,
As in what?
Stand your ground and fly.
no, but when you take a look, for example, at Christians' discussion of what is considered a just war, and of course we don't have that discussion because as I always like to say, on a certain sense in Judaism, all wars are unjust, but some are necessary, okay? That a legitimate war is a war of self-defense, like the Second World War, right? Or one could say that the 1967 war, where the Israelis preemptively attacked because they knew they were being threatened, was a form of active self-defense. There's, do you have to wait for somebody to attack you, or can you go out and attack them if they are immediate, what do they call it, a clear and present danger, right? Now, yes, that can be a slippery slope, but that is a very well-defined concept in Western legal traditions coming out of Christian legal ideas, that a just war, that wars of self-defense are legitimate wars.
Who is Hakam le'argecha, Hashkem le'orgo? Where is that from?
Oh, that's in the Talmud.
So that's
Okay, it's
already
in Tractate Sanhedrin. So the point, and in the Jewish tradition, self-defense is considered a legitimate. You're allowed to kill somebody in self-defense. In fact, you're allowed to go after somebody who looks like they're going to kill somebody else and try and stop them. And we talked about this. This is the law of the rodef, the pursuer. You are allowed to kill a pursuer if necessary. You're supposed to try and wound them, even before they have committed their act, if it appears that they are a clear and present danger to somebody. You take that law from the individual to the nation, and one could say that wars of self-defense are legitimate. The question is when you start redefining what self-defense is. No, but that's why I'm saying that's the argument. there is a legitimate form of self-defense.
I never contested that.
But that's what they see.
What I said here was I did not agree with the Melech Mitzvah in chapter 6, Halakha
Right.
1, being a legitimate war of self-defense.
Well, but Maimonides would
because if you take that, Rabbi,
Yeah.
and you go on to say, I have to annihilate all of the 6.
No. You see, that's the point. I think Maimonides in his own day, when the Canaanites didn't exist anymore, again, this is entirely theoretical on his part, but I think that he would agree that wars of self-defense are, he called them Milchemet Mitzvah. Again, he subsumes the category of obligatory war into mitzvah war because he understands that the concept of an act of self-defense is a mitzvah. That's why he's doing that. Okay? All right. Let's go back. So that's the stuff on warfare. I just want to point out, you asked about the laws of the sons of Noah. He deals with that, if you go to page 221 in our books, he deals with that in chapters 8 and 9 of the laws of kings. Because that's what he does. You know, he mentions it in the previous texts about the if you capture the town, they've got to submit to becoming under the laws of Noah. So in chapter 8 and at the end of chapter 8 and most of chapter 9, because he goes into it in greater detail than you see here in our excerpts, he deals with this. So I think it's worth taking a look at this in the time we have remaining. So Paul, you want to read, Ellie, you have it for him? Page 221, chapter 8, number 10. Moses, our teacher.
Moses, our teacher, bequeathed law and commandments to Israel, as it is said, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob, and to those of other nations who are willing to be converted, as it is said, one law and one ordinance shall be for both of you, and you should read, and for the resident alien.
So he's taking the term resident alien as the rabbis understood it to mean a convert, which it didn't mean in its original context, but the rabbis thought it was. And he's saying is laws of the Torah apply equally both to born Jews and converts, okay? And he was very strong on that idea that converts should be treated absolutely equally, and we even see that in his responsa, okay? Then, but however, he goes on to say, but...
Right? No coercion to accept the law and commandments is practiced and a commandment by God to compel all human beings to accept
on those who are unwilling to do so.
Unwilling. Any word?
Moreover, Moses, our teacher.
Moreover, Moses, our teacher, commanded enjoining a proper sense of Noah. Anyone who does not accept them is put to death. He who does accept them is invariably sound and resident alien. He must declare his acceptance in the presence of 3 associates. Anyone who has declared his intention to be circumcised and fails to do so within 12 months is treated like a heathen infidel.
Okay.
Where does he come up with the time?
Okay, now this is fascinating. He says here that, number one, we are not compelling people. We don't go around forcibly converting people, on the one hand. And of course, he would not there was no, except for one time in Jewish history, there was never any attempt to coerce people to become Jews. It was under the Hasmonean king John Hyrcanus, he compelled the Idumeans to become Jews or leave, and some of them left and some of them stayed and became Jews. but he wouldn't have known about that because he didn't have the documents to know that. He didn't have Josephus, in other words. But then he says, however, all human beings can be compelled to take the commandments of the sons of Noah, which appears to contradict what he just said on some level. But in effect, he was saying, and some people interpret this, by the way, as another concept of kind of holy war, right? That heathens, pagans, must be compelled to follow the laws of the sons of Noah, and that you don't accept them, they're put to death. So this is a really difficult part where he seems to be contradicting himself on some level, right? And you're not required, Gentiles are not required to become full converts to Judaism, although if they do, they are equal, but they are compelled to follow the laws of the sons of Noah. And then, Ellie, you want to read number 11?
Could I just ask,
yeah.
It's fascinating because here it appears to sort of comply with John Harkness. They compel all human beings to accept the commandments.
The basic commandment.
But there's no biblical citation to justify.
Exactly.
You just
There
pull
isn't.
it out of the air?
No, well, that's a good question. I mean, he's partly getting it from rabbinic literature, but when he talks about he who does accept them, that's the convert. In other words, from that point on, he's talking about the convert. But the fact of the matter is that he's sort of getting that's a good question. I don't know where he's getting it from.
To me, that doesn't say that that's a convert to Judaism. That's someone who accepts the seven.
No,
Accepts the
because the laws of the commandment don't require them to be circumcised. So he's from he who does not accept them, who does accept them. In other words, if you go back up to the resident alien, that's what he means by a convert. So in other words, you have to bracket that other part, right? Now take a look at number 11. Ellie, you want to read that? A heathen
who accepts the 7 commandments and observes them scrupulously is a righteous heathen, and will have a portion in the world to come, provided that he accepts them and performs them, because the Holy One, blessed be he, commanded them in the law and made known through Moses our teacher that the observance thereof has been enjoined upon the descendants of Noah even before the law was given. But if his observance thereof is based upon a reasoned conclusion that he is not deemed a resident alien or one of the pious of the Gentiles, one of their wise men.
This is pure Maimonides, okay? He in effect saying, because the rabbis just talk about, if a Gentile accepts the seven commandments, they're considered to be a righteous Gentile, and therefore they have a share in the world to come. Maimonides, however, introduces the notion is that they have to accept them as commandments from God, as opposed to being a Gentile who on their own rational, initiative comes to follow these laws, not as commandments, but as ways of life. Then they don't fall under the category of righteous Gentile, but they fall under the category of wise man, right? And here he in effect is saying that, it's okay to be a philosopher, and, philosophy might lead you to these moral precepts, but in the end, in order to be technically a righteous Gentile, you have to also accept that God commands, as opposed to a God who is, the unmoved mover, right? A force. For him, God has to, there still has to be this notion of revelation, right? And that's what he is doing here. It's a very interesting distinction he's making that you don't find anywhere else, by the way. Okay? In chapter 9...
what he's saying is, if you're a Gentile and you do the right thing, God commanded it.
No, you have to believe that God commanded it in order to be considered a righteous Gentile. If you do the right thing on your own without believing that God commanded it, then you're a wise man, but you're not a righteous Gentile. And then in chapter 9, he gives you the 6 precepts: prohibition of idolatry, of blasphemy, of murder, of adultery, robbery, command to establish courts of justice. Okay? And he says, although there's a tradition that this goes back to Moses, it evident from the general tenor of Scripture, and so on and so forth. He gives you the various ways, and the rabbis in various texts in the Talmud parse it out from the story of Adam and the story of Noah. And then the rest of this chapter, he goes through it in detail about what each one of these things means, which we're not gonna take a look at. Okay, so we're gonna end now. Next week we're gonna go on with the issue of the Messiah, which we will look at chapter 11. We're going to use what we've got here exclusively, since there's a lot to do here. I'll show you some material. We'll talk a little bit about the origin of the messianic concept, and what did and so on and so forth, to put Maimonides in context. And also, I'm going to stop this now.